Hello, students and strangers on the internet. Let's talk about sight measuring. Sight measuring is a term used to describe the methods and techniques used to draw something well based on sight. Basically, they're things that we can do when we're drawing something based on what we're seeing to measure them and increase the accuracy of your drawing. So when it comes to sight measuring, there are three basic approaches or techniques. The first is the thumb measurement or the thumb test, which is used to identify an object's scale and proportion. Next is the hour of the clock, which is used to identify a line's pitch or angle. And lastly, the scanning test, or sort of what I call Terminator vision, is a test to identify an object's position in space up, down, and left and right. Okay, so before we take a look at this still life, just like there are the three ways of sight measuring, there are three things that we need to keep in mind when we sight measure. So sight measuring, we essentially use a measuring pencil. I usually use a colored pencil because it's bright and it makes it easier to see. In our non-drawing hand, I'm right-handed, so I draw with my right, and I'll use my left hand to measure. So when I'm using my left hand to measure, I want to extend my arm the full length. One of the upsides is when you're sight measuring, my arm's not going to get any longer or shorter, hopefully, as I'm drawing this object. So that gives me a standard unit of measurement. If I sort of if I bend my elbow, you'll notice that the width of this pencil gets larger or smaller because it's physically moving in space. So I want to make sure and keep my arm extended the entire way, and I want to make sure and do that while I'm measuring. I also want to close the eye that is not above the arm I'm measuring with. So I want to keep my left eye open because I'm measuring with my left arm. If I were measuring with my right arm, I would want to close my left eye. And what that allows us to do is that allows us to take our sort of two-point view in space, where we're seeing with both eyes, and then collapse them into one view. If you've ever done that like Wayne's World thing where you camera one, camera two, where you look at an object in the distance and it kind of moves based on which eye is open, we're trying to restrict that from happening. So I'm going to extend my arm all the way. I'm going to close the eye that is not above my measuring arm. And lastly, I want to make sure and pay attention to how parallel and perpendicular the pencil is in my measuring hand. If we're going to use this, we're essentially going to use this element of the pencil beyond the palm and fingers of my hand to measure with. We can do the scanning test, we can do the hour of the clock, and we can do the thumb test. But all those depend on us keeping this element of the pencil as parallel or perpendicular as possible. If I were to try and measure something using the edge of this pencil, but I were to then sort of point it toward the camera, you'll notice that the length of this line changes in space. You want to avoid that. I kind of refer to it as like the wizard pose. You don't want to point with the pencil. You want to keep it as perpendicular or parallel. Okay, so now we've gone over kind of the basics of what you need to make sure and do. Let's take a look at that still life, and we'll see what each of these sight measuring methods actually measure. Okay, so here we have a group of objects not moving, thus a still life. But we're looking at a still life, and we can take a look at what I mean when I talk about the three ways of sight measuring. What we're kind of seeing is we're seeing an approximation of my perspective, where we can see down the barrel of my arm and use this pencil to measure. So, again, the first way of sight measuring, the thumb test, is used to measure the scale and proportion of objects, the size of things. So very briefly, scale is a size and weight relationship between objects. So if I were to measure sort of the height of this wine bottle versus the 2-liter, that is an issue of scale. Proportion is the size and weight relationships of a form. If I were to try and figure out, the height of this section, how many is it tall? That is a matter of proportion. So scale, size and weight relationships between forms. Proportion is the size and weight relationships that describe one form. Okay, so to do the thumb test, I'm going to extend my arm, again, keeping my elbow unbent, keeping my arm straight out. I'm going to keep the pencil parallel or perpendicular to the ground based on what I'm measuring. I'm going to not point it, basically. What I can do is I can measure visually sort of the height and width of objects, or the height and width of areas of an object. So we're going to use this sort of tan, gross, fleshy cake up front. It's one of my favorite objects. It's very sort of grossly colored. What we're going to do is let's start with sort of a size and weight, or a height and width issue of the total object itself. So what we want to try and figure out right now is, in drawing this, is it wider or is it taller? You could do like that weird Blue's Clues thing where you can like pause the video and try to do this yourself at some point. That's totally okay. But so we want to get the width of this and compare it against its height. In drawing this, that matter of proportion is going to be super important. So if I take the edge of this pencil right here, the flat end, not the sort of pointy bit, I'll take the flat end and I'll rest that against the furthest point right on the cake, and I'll take my thumb and I'll slide it down the body of the pencil until my thumb gets to where the edge of the cake is on the left. So I have the right end of the flat end of the pencil here and my thumb right around here. And that lets me get a good measurement of how wide the cake is. Now, why am I measuring it from here to here? Because those are the furthest points along the width. It's narrower here than it is here. So I'm taking that width, and let's take that width, and I'm going to keep my thumb in the same place. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my pencil to be vertical. And because I left my thumb in the same place, I have the same measurement. And I turn that, and I put my thumb against the bottom of the cake, and then I can see where the top of this pencil ends in the body of the cake. And wouldn't you look at that? It is almost as wide as it is tall. So it's almost a 1-to-1 relationship. Those subtle differences of how the proportions of an object are really help, and sort of the thumb test will help us measure from our drawing to the objects how accurate those are. Okay, so not only can we do that with the whole object itself, we can also do that with parts of an object. So what we'll do, instead of measuring the whole cake, let's measure from the edge of this sort of white trim on the bottom to the point up. How wide is this section versus how tall is it? This ellipse right here is just defined by the width and the height of its furthest point. So let's go ahead and do the same thing. Flat edge against the top. Slide my thumb down until it gets here. And what I can do is I can take this measurement and I can compare it and see how many wide is it. So the height from here to here, let's sort of take that and then let's put my thumb against right here. The distance between the edge of this cake here to the central sort of point, this is wider than this is tall. So I can kind of measure, oops, there we go. I can measure that and I can compare it here and tell that from the point of this rim to the center of this dot, this is a wider sort of section. So we can use it to measure the whole object to parts of an object. Now, obviously, we don't have to stick to one object. We can take, let's say that we were worried about, maybe we drew this 2-liter in this cake and they didn't look quite right. And there was maybe one was looking larger than the other. We can get a unit of measurement from this cake and then assess it to other objects within here. So let's get that same measurement. I'm going to go from the sort of white trim to the bottom of the cake. Sort of slide our thumb down. And we can try and find where else in this still life do we find that measurement. If we take it to the 2-liter, we can notice along this radial band above these dots, there's a kind of line right there. So from the line here to the line there, that height of that cake is almost, or the height of the cake from this face is almost exactly the same as the distance between this line and that line. So we can use these comparative measurements of proportion from parts of one object along others. Not only can we measure objects or parts of an object themselves, I think students forget, and it's really important, or it's really helpful a lot, is we can also measure the distance between objects. So if I were to try and figure out how far apart these two are, I can take the measurement from the cake to the edge of this box and try and find that measurement within the objects also. So let's try and find that. Let's go right here and let's measure, it's about that tall. And I can take this measurement and try to find where else does it exist in space. It's almost the distance between the white trim and the center dot. And wouldn't you look at that? It's almost exactly the distance or the height from the bottom of this silver bowl to the top of the face of the silver bowl. So we can take those measurements and also compare proportions and scales for the spaces between them. Okay, so the second way of sight measuring after the sort of thumb test or thumb measurement is the hour of the clock. Again, this hour of the clock is used to measure the angles of a line. So we have some good examples of angles, sort of the edge of this box here, the edge of the box here, and the edge of this box over here. This one's really subtle. These are a little bit steeper. So part of what we do, let's go ahead and let's measure this line right here. We can do the same thing, keep our arm fully extended, and instead of doing sort of straight up and down or straight left and right, I can lay the edge of this pencil against this box right here and mirror my pencil to the angle of that line. If I were to sort of move this straight up to get it more clearly, I can then look at this line and see how steep it is. Now, hour of the clock part comes in as if we look at the angle of this line and move it straight up, we can take this line and sort of view it as the hour hand of a clock and determine which hour it might be. So if straight up and down is noon, that's 3 o'clock, this is 6 o'clock, and this is 9 o'clock. What hour would the angle of this line be? So again, we'll kind of get that measurement. We'll take it straight up. And that's about 2, maybe 2:30. It's between 2 and 3. Now, the clock sort of analogy or whatever is just because the clock is a very common object that uses angles. We don't always have to assess it to an actual hour. We can also use this sort of hour of the clock where we lay the edge of the pencil against a line and just try to identify simply, does it go from point 1 to point 2, does it go up or down? Especially with these really subtle lines. In trying to draw this still life, the angle of this line is not very steep at all. If we consider this point right here to be point 1 and this point over here to be point 2 next to the 2 liter, from point 1 to point 2, does it go up? Is it level or does it go down? So an easy way to kind of point that out in a still life for a drawing is to actually lay the pencil against that edge, and we can look from the left half of this. The left point of this line is higher than the right. So from left to right, it goes down into the right. That's sort of an easy exercise that we can do, is just from point 1 to point 2, does it go up? Does it go down? Or is it level? Just like with the thumb test, we can with the thumb test, we don't need to just pay attention to the objects, but the space between them. With the hour of the clock, we can not only measure the angles of objects, but also the angle of the table that the objects rest upon. These angles are kind of hard to identify early on in a drawing, so laying the pencil against that edge and seeing just how steep that is can be really helpful. Okay, so now that we've gone over the thumb test and the hour of the clock, the last, and my favorite, at least by name, is the sort of scanning test or Terminator vision. So what I mean by that is instead of sort of sliding our thumb down to get a measurement of something, and instead of laying the pencil against an edge, we're just going to keep our pencil straight up and down or straight left and right. So the up and down position, the vertical position, is for finding which objects exist furthest left or furthest right. So if we were to try and draw these objects, trying to figure out exactly how far away the edge of this box is versus the edge of this tomato. If we keep the pencil straight up and down and just scan it, sort of from one side to the other, we can see the distance between the box and the tomato, and we can see right about where the tomato and the wine bottle meet. But it lets us find, as a kind of scanning test, left and right positions. In the same way, if we keep it horizontal, we can get vertical measurements. So a good thing to kind of check as an example is, if we look at the edge of this purple box, this vertical edge, is this edge further left or right, or is it in line with the point of this little spout? So we can look at it and get an idea of which is furthest left and right, which is up and down. But to actually measure that well, using the scanning test can help point that out. So we're going to do, this is an issue of left and right, so we're going to keep our position, or our pencil vertical, and we're going to lay our pencil against the edge of that box. And when I get the pencil against the edge of that box, I can see just how much space there is. Let's try and get the other pencil in there. Just how much space there is between the edge of the pencil and the spout. So if we were to try to figure out which is furthest left, the box or the spout, we can see pretty clearly, let me get that, pretty clearly that it is the box, and by exactly how much identified in this gap. That could be really subtle things, like the difference between the box and the spout, or things that appear a little bit more obvious, but maybe don't appear right away. In the same way that we can measure differences sort of left and right, we can also do them vertically. If we look, the top of this 2 liter and the top of that apple almost look exactly in line. Now, I know that's really small, but small things also matter in a drawing. So we can take that, because it's a vertical assessment, we're going to hold the pencil horizontal, and we can lay that right against the top of that apple. And we can see this little teeny tiny, stop focusing on the arm, this little teeny tiny gap between, let me hold this really flat, between the top of the apple and the 2 liter. There's a tiny little gap. So they're nearly exactly ending at the same place, but this top of the apple is just barely higher up in the drawing than the 2 liter. Okay, so now that we've talked about how to actually sight measure the 3 different ways with the still life itself, ultimately what we're trying to do is apply these measurements to a drawing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a photo of the still life, and I'm going to quickly draw this still life, and then what we'll do is we'll take a look at the photo versus the drawing, and then we'll use these 3 different ways of sight measuring to better correct our drawing as we would in class. So now that I've done a pretty quick drawing of the still life setup, you can kind of see where the objects are in relation to each other, the size of the cake, the tomato here, tomato there. So there's tomato 1, 2, and 3, shiny thing. Now, this is about as far as I would get the drawing before I started to really correct. Now, if you notice, I think from beginning to end, that was maybe 10 minutes, and I was going maybe a little bit slower just to make sure I didn't do this wrong, because I am actually drawing from a screen up that way. It's kind of a weird perspective for everything. But so now that we have sort of everything drawn in here, there's a kind of like mantra or saying I have a lot, which is vague to specific, which is essentially start with the largest shapes to the smallest shapes. I started with something like the cake and the height of the rose. You'll notice I did these lines here, and there's one right down around here. I did these 2 lines just to kind of vaguely note this is near the top of the objects. This is actually where I intended for the rose to be, this sort of line left and right, and the line down here was near the baseline of the cake. But it allowed me within this total drawing surface to kind of get an idea of where things start and where things stop. And basically at this point, we can take this drawing, compare it to the photograph or the thing we're actually drawing from, which in your instance will be a photograph. But we can start to actually make some corrections here. So if I were to look at the actual still life objects themselves, like let's say, for instance, that I'm going to try and clarify the tomato cake to 2-liter combo. I try to keep in mind, and when looking at it, you do this one, you'll kind of get it. But one thing I kept in mind was that the top of this tomato ends before the edge of this line. But there are probably some things that are not real. Most of this 2-liter is not real accurate. Notice that I was this height of this cap of the 2-liter is a little too wide. The body itself is maybe a bit funny. Yeah, that's right. This bottle's real wonky. But so, like, one thing I can see that's wrong in looking at this cluster of objects is if we look at the object, or we look at the still life, where the 2-liter, let me kind of clarify the edge of this 2-liter. This is a 4B, so I'm able to kind of make it dark by just pressing it a little bit more hard. If we look at the edge of the 2-liter and where it meets the actual tomato, you can tell in my original drawing it wasn't quite right, because we can see there's this section of the 2-liter right through here that is visible in the image that was not originally visible here. And then I can come in here and kind of clarify the edge here. But once we have it to this level of kind of quickly drawn, I usually encourage students to try and get it to this level in 5 to 10 minutes. That way they can spend the next sort of hour or so fixing it. Then we can come in here and try and make it a little bit more accurate. If I were to sight measure, like this tomato is real funny. I need to figure out how big this tomato is. If I were to sight measure the tomato, it's almost the same width. We can try to start to clarify clearly the tomato. The bottom of the tomato actually ends near the cake, so I think that might actually be part of the problem. But from this point, we can actually start to clarify and use those sight measuring techniques to kind of bring it to more clarity. More than just that, if we were to look at another place that I'm seeing that's maybe not so right is in the top of the 2-liter. Let me just kind of give that a little bit. In the top of the 2-liter, comparing that to the distance between the top of the 2-liter and this sort of darkest bunch of leaves, the angle of that line that I have here, let's try and get it here. It's much sort of less steep. It's a little bit higher, stuff like that. But basically, once we get it to this level of drawing, then we can start to apply those sight measuring techniques and bring it to a sort of full clarity. Oh yeah, I also forgot. Let's throw in those corner of the tables real quick. It always helps. So, like, if I were to try to add the corners of the tables, what I can see is along the body of this sort of box, the edge of the table is right around here and comes out right around here. So that lets me know if I were to sort of draw it sort of like that, maybe not so steep. And then we can add the other side coming out of the 2-liter right around here and being something like that. There's actually a corner of a wall in there. Let's add that real quick. Okay, boom. Now, obviously I could spend this time forever just drawing this more, but actually, let's set that, speak of the devil, let's get that shadow in there. Let's kind of get that, just the last thing before we stop. You'll notice that I drew some of the shadows down here, but the shadows are also helpful in helping us describe the shapes. In the same way we measure the shapes, or the spaces between shapes, we can also draw the shadows to help sort of locate where everything is. All the information found in the drawing can help make the drawing more accurate. Okay, so just to recap, 3 different types of sight measuring: the thumb test, the out of the clock, and the scanning test or Terminator vision. Remember to keep your arm fully extended. Also, I don't think I said this, but remember that when you're looking down your arm and closing one eye, make sure to kind of keep the same eye closed the whole time, or else it gets the measurements funny. Other than that, it's pretty much just practice and sort of working through it to get better. As always, if you guys have any questions, especially if you're one of my students, send me an email. Other than that, go team.